Hello and welcome. I'm so glad to have you join me as we venture into the world of vampires. We're going to look at vampires then and now, looking into vampire mythology. So this week is all about our fanged tooth friends. And the reading that you did was focusing around vampire lore, mythology, representation, symbolism, social, political, all sorts of ideas about vampires. So let's delve right in to explore what you read and what you might have thought. And for monster culture, you'll notice that I've provided you a video that I'd like you to watch separately. So right now I want you to go ahead and pause. And if you started with this voice thread before you watched the monster culture recording that I created for you, please go back to that on Canvas on the Professor discussion presentation 5.0 page, or assignment actually, and view that. Jot down some notes and ideas and any questions you might have, any ideas you might want to add, any questions that you want to answer that I posed in that presentation. Then come back here and come back to this slide and share your thoughts, your questions, whatever you wanted to say about that piece. Remember that Cohen's piece can be found on page 184, and it's between 184 and 189. It's an excerpt from the larger work that I also provided on the professor discussion presentation page or assignment. So if you were interested, you could read the whole thing, but essentially I walk you through all of the elements of the 7 theses that Cohen puts together. So I can't wait to hear what you have to say, what your questions are, and to engage with you more about monster culture. I do want you to keep in mind that these ideas and philosophical perspectives will be useful to you moving forward through the rest of the class. Oops. Okay, so let's turn to page 35 through 38, Why Vampires Never Die. And so take a moment, pull out your textbook, open it up. A couple of things that I want to draw your attention to. We've been talking about introductory paragraphs, concluding paragraphs, and now this week, thesis statements. So I want to draw your attention to some of these things so that we can also engage in a conversation about the actual writing of the reading that we're doing. And then I also want us to explore the ideas of the actual concepts and meaning, and pull out golden nuggets that we might want to explore more of from the different readings. And so we've got this piece here, and the pictures here. The vampire is about relates to the Polidori's book, and then that's the vampire, a picture of the cover of the book, and then this is a picture of Lord Byron, and he's mentioned throughout this piece as well. And then you've got the image of the strain, and so that image is that FX television series that Guillermo del Toro and Chuck Hogan wrote, and was on FX. So those are some of the visuals that you can see and look at. So first of all, What do you think of the introduction? Tonight, you or someone you love will likely be visited by a vampire. I don't even need to read on. For me, I'm hooked, right? So we can think about different ways to hook, draw in our reader. And then it's sort of interesting. I don't know what you think, but it seems like the first few paragraphs actually serve as sort of an extended introduction. They hook you in, they give some background information, they give some contextual meaning, and then so I'm curious, do you think it's effective, ineffective? One thing that we want to keep in mind with some of the readings that we do for our class is that we're not always reading straightforward essays. So on the previous slide, Cohen's piece was a formal essay. So we can apply some of the essay writing techniques and we can evaluate it with those essay writing techniques in mind. This piece, as you know, it was published as a column in the New York Times, as the head note says. And so we can still ask for thesis statement like statements. We can still look for good writing in the form of intriguing introductions and thought-provoking conclusions. Certainly, and even an article in a newspaper, an author should have a main idea, a thesis statement that they want to address or support or convey. So we can look for those things, but I just want to highlight this notion that it's not always a straightforward essay. So we may not be able to use the same sort of criticism, constructive criticism for these authors that we might for our own essays when we're doing peer reviews or looking at our own individual work. The other thing, though, that I also want to remind you is that even though we're reading works by published authors, that doesn't mean that their writing is perfect. I can't tell you how many times I've read things that I was like, egads, man, that's poor writing. Just because it's published doesn't mean it's the pinnacle of writing. So I want to empower you also to, you know what you think is good and poor writing, and you know what interests you and doesn't interest you. So you are allowed to come to these works with a critical eye, as well as looking at what is done well. So all of that is to say, take a look at the introduction. It's not going to be the same sort of introduction as we're going to have in our essays, but we can still see some techniques that were used for this piece that are similar to those we've discussed. Now I'm interested in where do you think the thesis statement is? And I would say pause, take a moment, look for it if you haven't already. This is something that I would encourage you to do as you move forward. Everything that we discuss in class related to writing, so introductions, conclusions, this week thesis statements, next week paragraphs, you should start looking for, identifying, analyzing those things, those elements in each work. So now I'm curious what you think the thesis statement is. To be honest, I don't know about you, but for me, there seems to be almost two thesis statements. There's kind of two main ideas that are proven, but I'm curious if you, whichever thesis statement you selected, what in the paragraphs, what in the rest of the analysis or explanation or conversation in this piece seems to support or relate to or prove whatever it is you think the thesis statement is. I'm going to go ahead and share what it is. So if you don't want to know yet, or what I think the two different possibilities might be, so if you look in, so if you don't want to know yet, pause it and then make your own statement. But paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4. With the vampire, Polidori gave birth to the two main branches of vampiric fiction, the vampire as romantic hero and the vampire as undead monster. For me, I see a lot of the analysis in the rest of the paragraphs relating to that idea. But then also, when I get to paragraph 7 on page 36, monsters like angels are invoked by our individual and collective needs. It doesn't name the vampire as the monster for this discussion, but it does seem that that's another idea that is developed throughout the other paragraphs also. So I want you to keep, what do you think? And did you find something else that was even better? Share it, because I could have missed it. And then let's go to the conclusion. What did you think about the conclusion here? Do you think it does conclude? Do you think that it effectively concludes the discussion? Does it leave you thinking as a reader and pondering back to the rest of what Del Toro and Hogan presented? And let's also look at, they have a sort of more traditional conclusion, but then they follow it up with a single word. Now, in our earlier essays, we might not want to have to do that just yet, but I don't mind if in your last essay, once you've shown that you understand what a good, effective conclusion looks like, if you want to have some creative license and do something creative like this at the end of an essay, but you would still need a sort of regular conclusion, and then you could do something more creative after that. I'm open to that. So that's something to ponder for your final essay for the class. So now let's get into the meaning of and what what ideas about vampires never dying and what Del Toro and Hogan present here, and how it applies to the excerpt from Bram Stoker's Dracula we read, and then also Backstein's piece, sort of comparing and contrasting older vampire mythology to modern. So I have a few things, ideas here that I wanted to tease out for you, and you're more than welcome to bring your own ideas or quotations forward for discussion as well. But if you look at page 36, and it is it's in paragraph, the end of paragraph 10. I want you to think about this concept and whether or not you think that you agree or disagree with what Del Toro and Hogan are saying here with this idea. And is the true essence of immortality adaptability? And then a follow-up to that would be, do you think that vampires, vampire mythology, vampire lore, that vampires as monsters who have captivated society's imagination is part of it because they are also adaptable and their story's adaptable? And then how does that relate to us as human beings? So that's all a part of that bullet point there. So ponder that, think on that. Next, I want to draw your attention to page 37. And this is when it's at the end of paragraph 14, right in the middle there. And I'm really curious if you agree or disagree or something else with what Del Toro and Hogan are saying here, not only about technology and scientific innovation, but also and the dystopia of dissatisfaction, as they call it, but also how does that all relate to this concept of the vampire and vampirism? And I think the other question I want to expand upon here is, do we learn more about ourselves as individuals and even as a collective society by understanding our monsters, and more specifically, what might vampires tell us about ourselves and about what we think? So there's that. And then last but not least, on page 37, a little bit further down, it's at the top of paragraph 16. I really find this idea about vulnerability and spiritual humility to be really intriguing. And I'm curious, one, if you think they proved the ideas that they present here throughout the rest of their essay or their article, because it is the conclusion, right? So should they have developed those ideas enough elsewhere? And then two, I'm curious to know how you think the idea of vampires represent or relate to this concept of vulnerability. And that's more in paragraph 15, and then this spiritual humility. So I can't wait to learn more about what you think about that there. So now that we've kind of covered that, let's turn to page 190 in your textbook. And let's talk about Dracula a little bit. So if you haven't read this novel, it's pretty intriguing. And if you like vampire stories, it's quintessential, right? And a lot of the vampire mythology comes from this text. In the section that we're reading, the story's being told in epistolary form, right? And that means that it is written in either letter form, journal entries, right? A couple of things. So this is more, we're analyzing not an essay, but an actual work of fiction. And we are thrust into a pretty racy section of the novel here. And we get some concepts. It's pretty clear that Jonathan Harker is feeling trapped and imprisoned, and that he desires to escape this imprisonment, and that he's been given strict orders from Dracula to not go into certain areas, but his natural curiosity has him explore and go where he oughtn't to be. And then he encounters a disconcerting situation where he gets to see the vampires in their full glory, and then even sees Dracula, who up until this point in the novel has been presenting himself as a human, reveals his more vampiric side in front of Harker, which is rather striking for Harker. A couple of things that's pretty interesting that you've read about in other pieces for this week that I want to bring forward to you is this concept, especially in Victorian England at the time, the repressed sexuality. People were still engaging in sexual exploits, but there was a repressed nature to it. It was behind closed doors. It was not considered appropriate or proper behavior. You certainly didn't talk about sex. Women weren't really supposed to enjoy sex. It was thought that they didn't enjoy sex. And if they were a good, proper, spiritual Christian woman, that she wouldn't really be a sexual being. So there's a lot of things happening, and I think this piece and the section that we're reading from really shows a reflection of a couple different sides of that repressed sexuality. So before we get to it, because I'm going to kind of jump ahead to the empowering, restricting, and judging women, I want to ask you, who besides Harker do you think is imprisoned in this piece? And who has the power and authority? Who is subservient? And what do you make of that power dynamic within the vampire society? Even looking at this picture of Dracula and the three vampire women, even the way that it's visually presented, going from what we've discussed about reading visual rhetoric from earlier weeks in the semester, we can see who's center, who's standing. Are these differential positions that the women is certainly kneeling and holding on shows some dependence on Dracula, right? But are these women here of their own volition? Are they imprisoned? So something to consider and think about. And then what does that reveal about gender roles within the monster realm, certainly within the vampire realm, but also how is that perhaps a mirror or reflection of society at the time? But then also, how does that relate to us today? Next, going back a little to the repressed sexuality and jumping forward into the empowering, restricting, and judging women. This is a really interesting scene because on one hand, coming from this 2020s perspective, contemporary mind, we're seeing these women embracing their sexuality, going after what they desire, being forthright and even aggressive in a way that seems like female empowerment, right? But at the time, notice that these women are monsters. So if the monster is the other, if the monster, think back to what you discovered through Cohen's piece in Monster Culture, if the monster represents debased desire or repressed desire or unholy desire or sinful desire, then would the female monsters, would the society be saying that women are women who embrace their sexuality and feel empowered to show their desire and engage in their lustful tendencies are monsters, that they are the antithesis of what true womanhood should be? So that's an interesting thing to think about, right? And is there some judgment? I mean, there's some of these actions are being presented as being unnatural, right? And what is it that's being unnatural? And through the telling of this story, is there some sort of instruction? Is it simply providing an alternate view to society's perspective of chaste women and the necessity for them to be pure and virginal? Or is it reflecting how the world ought to be, that women should be free? And so that's one part of it that I want you to consider and think about. But then also it's right at the end here on page 194, and Harker remembers hearing a half-smothered child that it's very clear these women are going to consume. And it horrifies Harker, right? And this is an interesting twist and so many layers and levels to it that are so fascinating that Stoker is taking the, is countering the women's expected role as nurturers and mothers and caregivers to children, and then showing these women as being unnatural consumers and causing harm to the children. And so that's also a fascinating thing to consider when we are looking at whether or not society is being, women are being instructed as to how they ought to and ought not to behave, and which of their actions would be considered natural, unnatural, normal, abnormal, human, or monstrous. So, and I have these ideas here, but you know what? Whatever you pull out from the reading, please share that as well. So let's go ahead and move over to Backstein's Unsafe Sex, Romancing the Vampire, and that's on page 196, right after Stoker's piece. You know what? I haven't been raising it, but you're also free to answer any of the questions. There's some really great questions, by the way, in the understanding the text and reflection and response sections at the end of each of the works in your textbook. So those are questions that you're more than welcome to look at and to respond to in our discussion here as well. And you can also use those questions to help you think about what you might write about in your essays. So this, I hope you think, was a really fun piece as well. The pictures that I'm showing here, I wanted to show you a couple of things about True Blood that they were mentioning. And then the Vampire Diaries is on this top here, the two brothers, the Salvador brothers, and then the originals and legacies stem out of the Vampire Diaries. And then we've got the original Buffy the Vampire Slayer television show. There was a film too, but the television show is pretty cool. If you haven't watched it, it would be it's a brilliant snapshot of the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, I think. And it's very much the style of that time period, but also it's campy and a lot of fun. So again, let's inspect the introduction. What do you think about this intro? What does it do for you? Does it intrigue you? Is it a little bit drier? What do you think? And then where do you find the thesis statement? You can push pause, look at it, think on it, consider it. For me, it's this one's a little bit more straightforward. It's an article in a magazine, but it certainly seems like Karen Backstein has a clear message to put forward. And so to me, in the second paragraph, that first sentence there is what I sort of saw as the thesis statement. I'm curious if you agree or disagree, or if you want to make an argument for a different possible thesis statement. And then let's look at the conclusion. This one was interesting to me. So on some of your essays, you might find that I write continued analysis or concluding information. And for me, I don't feel like Backstein concludes the argument, concludes the analysis. To me, this paragraph seems to continue the discussion. Even the last line, ultimately, what Edward would most like to save her from is himself, the one task where he cannot succeed. It seems like it's just ending that paragraph's analysis, but not the entire article's analysis. What do you think? I'm curious to know. So for this piece, there was so much in here, and I'm so excited to delve into it because you might be familiar with some of these more modern views of vampires. But I do want you to think about what you read about Dracula, and then also from the examples here. I didn't put a picture of Twilight because most of us are familiar with Twilight. And so first I have here self-control versus self-indulgent. So what do you think about how vampires from the past and vampires from the present, has there been a shift from the self-indulgent vampires? And I mean, in that scene from the novel Dracula that we just read and discussed, the eating of children is pretty like the epitome of horrific self-indulgence, right? But then when we get to self-control, as you read about in True Blood, even the Vampire Diaries, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and in Twilight, there's this twist to wanting to have more self-control. So what do you think this switch with the more contemporary vampire and this desire for self-control, what lesson are we to gain from that? What is that reflecting about our contemporary society? What does that have us learn about ourselves, about each other, about the role of the vampire in today's society. When it comes to the female versus male centered narrative, this is also interesting, especially when we move from that excerpt from the Dracula novel, and that there's a sort of controlling aspect, censoring of female sexuality, and everything is being told through the male perspective, the male centered narrative. But as you read, and as you even see in these pictures with many of the women being front and center, we have female-centered narratives. What does that say about our contemporary society? What does that say about about vampires and what they represent? And you can even hearken to what Backstein says and her argument about how many of the modern vampire stories are written for female youth or adults. But hasn't it also got a broader audience, and don't all these stories also include other folks with other identities, even beyond female and male? So I want you to consider that. I also want you to look through and ponder from some of these examples and within this piece how vampires represent a social critique. And in one way, representation is really important. And Backstein talks about the concept of racism in terms of interracial relationships in paragraph 5 on 197 and to the top of 198. And miscegenation, interspecies mixing, there's certainly throughout time with our American society's experience with institutionalized slavery and with the institutionalized racism that has come out of our history with having enslaved people in our past, that throughout time there have been racist perspectives and racist based fears about commingling of the races, right? And so I want you to think about this, and especially with True Blood, it's set in the South. Bill Compton is a vampire from the Civil War era, and so the story does become a sort of social critique on the concepts of racism. And as you can see, there are some people of color represented in True Blood and in the originals who are vampires. But even as Backstein mentions, often we're looking at white vampires, but even in Twilight, we have some vampires of color as well, right? So it's interesting to see how that social critique of representation does or does not change over time. And if our monsters are becoming more inclusive or representative or not, and what does that reveal about our society? Sexuality is another place. Often these stories are dealing with heterosexual, cisgender folks, right? And heterosexual relationships and love relationships. Now, in True Blood, and I think Legacies for sure, Buffy a little bit, and maybe the originals. I can't remember the Vampire Diaries right now. I watched that so long ago. But there is more representation of people from the LGBTQ plus community. But there's something interesting when we're talking about the repression of sexuality, when we're talking about what a society deems to be natural, normal sexual expressions of sexuality, and what's considered abnormal or unnatural, it may not actually be abnormal or unnatural, and it could be an expression of bigotry or prejudice. But what is reflected in a society through the way that the monsters explore sexuality? So consider that. And then feminism. Even with your Backstein even sort of talks about some of the modern or contemporary vampire stories can be seen as having female empowerment. But is it tricky? Is it always something that we can see a feminist message in? Or sometimes are the stories even still anti-feminist? When we're thinking about Bella from Twilight, it seems like Edward is always, she's the damsel in distress, the quintessential damsel in distress, right? So that's not so much the female empowerment. Even in the Vampire Diaries, the main female is often the damsel in distress. But then when we get to other vampires, here, she's a wolf, a vampire, we have more empowerment. But we have the head of the family who's still a male who's in control. The male teacher who's in control. So there's some interesting things happening here when we're talking about gender, when we're talking about gender roles, when we're talking about how our monsters either perpetuate stereotypes, challenge stereotypes, and what sort of do we want to have a queer theory read of the film of vampires? Do we want to have a feminist read? We can do all sorts of things. So I want to hear your thoughts on some of that and what you think about the female representation in from this piece and in contemporary vampire stories. There's an interesting twist too that Backstein mentions about romantic hero versus monster. I'm not going to get too much more into that because I think she really covers this quite a bit, and I just want you to see what you might think about that and share your own thoughts on that. And then something that I found interesting in this piece that Backstein doesn't necessarily name outright, but she certainly describes it. And a lot of that is, especially toward the end, there's transformation. At the end of her piece on page 203, is there some anti-feminist ideas? But also with this, is there competition for the male gaze among some of the women in these stories? And is it perpetuating the patriarchal perspective of the need to value the male gaze, particularly for these heterosexual women? And then when we get to female competition, is that a byproduct of patriarchal rule as well, that in order that women are set up to compete with each other to gain the male gaze or to gain the male favor, because in a strict male-dominated society, do women have any other way to get a place at the table, so to speak, or a position in society if it's not granted by the male? So there's some really intriguing things that are happening with our monsters and our vampires and our past and current vampire stories, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say about them as well. One last thing before we move on is I would like you to take a look at pages 182 to 83 in your textbook. What is the power of the monster? And particularly, a couple of things that I want to pose to you about how does the monster, especially the vampire monster, represent the forbidden? In what way does the vampire represent the forbidden? How does the vampire represent the human desire for something outside of society's boundaries, what we see as being acceptable in society? And are the things outside of boundaries okay? Should those boundaries be pushed because those boundaries exclude some people? Or are the boundaries just beyond the boundaries for any human being? And you can think of these questions in relation to the other bullet points on this slide as well. I want you to think about the sense of can something dangerous excite us and thrill us and attract us, but then also repel us? And if so, why? Why does it repel us? And so also the vampires. Do the vampires excite and thrill and even attract us, but then are we also repelled? And why or why not? And when you read the rest of on the bottom of 182 to 183, that's looking ahead to when we discuss some other monsters in the future. So, wishing you a fangaful time as you ponder the fantastic world of fanged folks. You knew I had to get some vampire puns in there, right? And then I have another little vampire here. Are all vampires sexual and desirous and doing all those things, or do we also have some other kinds of vampires in the world? So something for you to ponder and think about, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts. Take care. Bye.